She stood alone on the prairie, belly swollen, breath shaking in the cold, watching the wagon train vanish without her. Not a single soul looked back. No water, no mercy. Just a pregnant widow left to die in silence. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The dust hung low in the air, not drifting but clinging as if reluctant to move, much like Abigail Harper, who stood frozen in its haze. Her hand instinctively shielded her stomach, though it offered no protection, only a silent gesture of defiance. The prairie stretched in every direction, silent and vast, with no trees, no homes, no witnesses. Only that indifferent horizon swallowing the backs of retreating wagons. Abigail had believed the worst of life was behind her. She had buried a husband, endured hushed whispers in church pews, and learned to sleep through the heavy silence of widowhood. But nothing in her grief-stricken past compared to the slow realization now rising in her chest like bile. She had been discarded, not simply left, but measured, judged, and found wanting. By a man who had once written, "You sound like a woman with a good heart. That's all I'm looking for." She had packed her hopes into that letter, read it by candlelight until the corners curled, folded it neatly, carried it in her apron, slept with it beneath her pillow as her belly grew rounder. She had sold her brooch and her rocking chair to pay for the passage, had made herself believe that a fresh start was not a fantasy but a matter of bravery, that love, real, honest love, might still be waiting at the end of the trail. But Samuel Klein's eyes held no warmth now, only a flicker of discomfort, as though he had expected someone less visible, someone easier to carry into a new life without explaining. Not a woman with a bump under her dress and shadows beneath her eyes. The cruelty wasn't in his words alone, but in the ease with which he walked away, in the silence that followed. Not one person reached for her arm. Not one offered to share water or speak her name. They looked through her, as if a pregnant woman abandoned in the wilderness was a thing best ignored, an inconvenience to forget before sundown. Her knees threatened to buckle, but she didn't fall. Not yet. She gripped the handle of the kettle left at her feet and lifted the frayed blanket to her shoulder. The fabric still smelled faintly of hearth smoke and lavender, remnants of a home that no longer existed. Somewhere, deep within, a thought surfaced. If this is where they leave me, then this is where I begin. But the wind had turned cold. The dusk did not fall gently that evening. It pressed down, heavy and cold, like a hand meant to smother. Abigail sat motionless, her back propped against a slanted boulder still warm from the day's sun, though the warmth did little now. The air had turned bitter, and each breath she drew felt thinner than the last. The prairie had no mercy, no walls to hold it back, no roofs to keep in heat. Just wind, wide sky, and silence. The kind of silence that stretched long enough to make a soul doubt it was still seen by God. Her fingers had gone stiff, curled around the tin handle of the kettle like it might anchor her to the world. Every muscle in her back screamed beneath the weight of pregnancy and humiliation. The ache in her legs spread upward, dull and relentless, pulsing in time with the memory of Samuel's voice. "We can't afford dead weight." The words had sunk deep, worming through layers of skin until they nested where her hope used to be. She had thought pain might make her cry, but there was a kind of sorrow that lived beyond tears. A quiet despair that sat heavy in the gut and spoke only in stillness. Abigail's stillness was not surrender. It was something colder. The stars began to show, one by one, brittle against the black. The wind snapped through the grass, curling around her ankles like it meant to test her. She did not shift, did not blink, only listened. Then, a sound. Faint, but certain. The irregular beat of hooves on dry earth. Her first thought was fear. Not sharp and sudden, but slow, resigned. So this is how it ends. She'd heard tales, of course, of travelers being robbed, even killed. A woman alone on the prairie was no more than a tale waiting to be told in past tense. But the man who approached did not speak, did not demand. His horse, a speckled paint, halted several paces away. He dismounted with grace, not haste. His presence was quiet, yet not unsure. He moved like someone used to wilderness, someone who trusted the land more than men. Abigail watched as he pulled a leather water pouch from his side and held it out, not with pity, but with precision, like an offering, not a favor. His eyes scanned her face, not her belly. When he knelt to check her ankle, it was with the care of someone who had no need for explanations. She wanted to speak, to ask who he was, why he had stopped. But all she could manage was one word, cracked and uncertain. Why? He met her gaze, and for the first time in hours she felt seen. Not judged, not measured, just seen. Because, he said gently, you are someone's mother. It was not a rescue, not yet, but it was the first thread of warmth in a night that had offered none, and his name, she would learn later, was Elias Grayleaf. The cabin stood with quiet purpose among the pines, its roof sagging slightly under years of weather, its walls the color of earth and soot, like it had grown up from the forest floor rather than been built. It was not large, but it was solid. And in its silence, Abigail Harper found something she hadn't known she'd lost: the dignity of stillness. Elias spoke little in those first days. His words, when offered, were shaped with intention, carved rather than tossed like stones. He rose before dawn, his footsteps soft across the packed dirt floor. When he returned near dusk, his arms bore the spoils of wilderness, knotted bundles of herbs, a snare of limp rabbits, sometimes the musky heft of venison. He said nothing of where he went, nor asked where she came from. In his world, survival was answer enough. Abigail didn't ask for permission. She saw the pan near the hearth and took to cooking, her hands remembering movements older than grief. She cleaned, swept the soot from corners, warmed rainwater for washing. When he noticed, he said nothing, but his offerings doubled. More wood stacked neatly outside the door, a basket of roots left on the table with care. The first time she cried, it came without warning. A rip in the sleeve of one of his shirts, a simple repair, and suddenly her hands trembled over the needle, the thread refusing to behave. The sound that left her throat was quiet, strangled, barely more than breath. But Elias noticed. He crossed the room without a word, set a folded quilt beside her, a patchwork of leather and cloth, edges hand-stitched with care, and walked away. There was no comfort spoken aloud. And yet, she had never felt more understood. At night, she sat close to the fire, letting its heat seep into bones, long robbed of softness. Once, she spoke, her voice low, unsure. I can work. I'm not useless. You don't need to keep me here. Elias didn't lift his head from the antler he was carving. His voice, when it came, was low and certain. You're not kept. You're healing. It was the first time she believed it. The days unfurled without haste. He taught her to snare rabbits with wire, to spot the curl of wind by the way grass leaned. She stitched new moccasins for him, her fingers steadier now. He told her of his father's knife passed down in silence. She spoke of her mother's cinnamon pie and the smell of it that lingered in winter. They did not build a romance. They built something older, slower, and rooted. A life, rebuilt from ash. The embers in the hearth burned long into each evening, glowing softly, like the memory of pain turned to warmth. The snow didn't vanish all at once. It melted in slow sighs, puddles forming beneath pine needles, rivulets carving through the still frozen ground. Abigail watched it from the cabin's porch, Thomas asleep against her chest in a sling of old muslin, his breath warm against her collarbone. The world was waking, not in a rush, but with purpose. Buds swelled on bare branches. The sky, though pale, softened its edge. And with each day, Elias moved with the rhythm of renewal, cutting wood, laying stones, hammering quietly as the sun climbed higher in the sky. He never announced his plans, never asked permission, but she understood them all the same. He was building an addition. Room for Thomas. Room for them. One morning she stepped outside to see him bent over a small cradle, running a flat stone along its edge. The wood was pine, pale and imperfect, but shaped with care. She stood beside him, arms crossed, voice low. "I didn't ask you to." "You didn't have to," he answered, sanding a corner smooth. No elaborate gestures, no declarations, just the truth, shared plainly. Whispers came, as whispers do, carried not by the wind but by the mouths of those who never look long enough to understand. Word had spread. The woman left behind now lived with a Shawnee man. They called it scandal. They called it shame. In town, a shopkeeper refused her coin. Another man, a familiar face from the wagon train, spat near her feet. Elias stood beside her like a shadow carved from cedar, unmoved. But it was Abigail who spoke. Her voice didn't shake. "I wasn't saved," she said clearly, meeting each eye without flinching. "I was seen." It silenced them more than any protest could. Spring arrived in earnest on a morning filled with birdsong and the slow blooming of dogwood petals, white as linen. Elias led her to the stump by the grove where they had once sat in silence. In her lap, he placed something carefully folded, the blanket she had worn the night they met, mended, lined with wool, a red thread stitched in a perfect circle at its center. "It means journey complete," he said softly. She traced the thread with trembling fingers, then reached for his hand, rough with work, covered it with her own. "Not complete," she whispered. "Just finally begun." There was no audience, no music, no grand vows. Just the three of them, man, woman, and child, bound not by debt or accident, but by something rarer, by choice.